She was a terrified golden retriever who had never known kindness. Her tail never wagged, her eyes always downcast. He was a lonely, gruff, retired truck driver, stuck in a life of silence and regret. When their worlds collided, it seemed impossible that they could heal each other. But one morning, as he slid her a piece of bacon, something extraordinary happened. Her tail moved for the first time. What started as a hesitant wag would lead to a bond so deep it would change both their lives forever. What brought this broken dog and this grieving man together? And how will their journey of trust and redemption unfold? Stay tuned for this heartwarming story that will leave you inspired and believing in second chances. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Charlie's alarm pierced the morning silence, its harsh buzz echoing through the empty bedroom. He blinked at the red numbers, 6:15 a.m., same as every day. Rolling onto his side, his joints creaked in protest. The morning light filtered through thin curtains, casting shadows on the sparse furniture. His gaze lingered on the dresser, where 2 photo frames sat collecting dust. Margaret's smile beamed from behind the glass, frozen in time at their son Jake's high school graduation. Charlie quickly looked away, his chest tightening. The hardwood floor felt cold under his feet as he shuffled to the bathroom. Each morning movement was mechanical, practiced over years of solitude. Brush teeth, wash face, comb what remained of his gray hair. In the kitchen, the coffee maker gurgled to life. Charlie stood watching it drip, the rich aroma filling the silent space. He pulled yesterday's newspaper closer, spreading it across the worn kitchen table. The headlines blurred together as his mind wandered. Later, the garage door groaned as Charlie pushed it open. Tools lined the walls in perfect order, wrenches arranged by size, screwdrivers sorted by type. The '57 Chevy pickup sat in the center, its faded blue paint telling stories of better days. Charlie had been working on it for months now, though there was no real rush to finish. He clicked on the old radio, turning the dial until Merle Haggard's voice filled the space. The familiar twang of guitars helped drown out his thoughts as he bent over the engine. But Margaret's memory snuck in anyway. Her laugh when he'd first brought the truck home, calling it his retirement project. Charlie turned up the volume, focusing on the carburetor in front of him. The morning slipped into afternoon, marked only by the changing songs on the radio and the growing pile of cleaned parts beside him. After washing up, he made himself a simple lunch, bologna sandwich and chips. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the quiet house. The knock came just as he was collecting his plate. 3 sharp raps that made him frown. Nobody visited without calling first. Charlie opened the door to find Debbie Matthews from next door, her face pinched with worry. Her hands twisted the strap of her purse. "Charlie, I'm so sorry to bother you," she said quickly. "But I need a huge favor. There's this dog at the shelter where I volunteer. They're over capacity and she needs a foster home just for a few days. I'd take her myself, but my Tommy's allergies." "Debbie," Charlie cut in, his voice gruff, "I don't do dogs." "Please," she pressed. "It's urgent. They'll have to." She left the sentence hanging, but her meaning was clear. Charlie's jaw tightened. He looked past Debbie to his empty driveway, to the quiet street beyond. The thought of disrupting his careful routine made his stomach clench. "Just for a few days?" he asked finally, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. Debbie's face lit up. "Yes. Oh, thank you, Charlie. You're a lifesaver. Literally." An hour after Charlie's reluctant agreement, Debbie's car pulled into his gravel driveway. Through the screen door, he watched her emerge with a leash in hand. Behind her, a golden retriever cowered, its tail tucked firmly between its legs. Charlie stepped onto his worn porch, crossing his arms. The dog's matted fur hung in dirty clumps, and its eyes darted frantically around the yard. "This is Bella," Debbie said softly, her voice tight with concern. "The rescue just pulled her from a terrible situation. The owner—" She lowered her voice. "Well, let's just say she's never known kindness." Bella pressed herself against Debbie's legs, trembling. Charlie's frown deepened as he noticed the way she flinched at every small movement. "Come on, girl," Debbie coaxed, trying to guide Bella toward the house. The dog planted her paws firmly in the gravel, refusing to budge. Charlie sighed heavily, moving into the kitchen. He cleared a corner near the back door, pushing aside his recycling bin to make space for the plush bed Debbie had brought. The tags were still attached. "There," he grumbled. "That should work." It took Debbie 15 minutes to convince Bella to enter the house. The dog crept forward inch by inch, her nails clicking against the linoleum. Charlie reached out to pat her head, but Bella jerked away, scrambling backward until she hit the wall. "Don't take it personally," Debbie said, placing a bag of food and some bowls on the counter. "She just needs time. Give her space. Let her come to you." After Debbie left, Charlie stood in his kitchen, staring at the trembling dog now huddled beneath his table. He heated up leftover meatloaf, trying to ignore the way Bella's eyes followed his every move. The kitchen clock ticked loudly as Charlie ate his dinner. Bella hadn't touched the food Debbie had poured into her bowl. She remained under the table, pressed against the wall, her breathing quick and shallow. Charlie finished his meal in silence, rinsed his plate, and walked to his recliner. He clicked on the TV but kept it muted, the blue light flickering across the dim room. From his chair, he could still see Bella's golden fur gleaming faintly under the kitchen table. The house felt different somehow, not exactly louder, but fuller. Charlie sat stiffly in his chair, hyper-aware of the frightened creature sharing his space. Neither of them moved, both waiting for the other to make the first gesture in this uncomfortable dance of coexistence. The bedside clock ticked past midnight, its red numbers glowing in the darkness. Charlie lay in bed, his eyes fixed on the shadowy ceiling above. The only light came from the small lamp on his nightstand, casting a weak yellow glow across the room. From the kitchen, soft whimpers broke through the silence. Charlie pulled his pillow over his head. "She'll settle down," he muttered to himself. "Just give it time." But Bella's cries continued, each whimper more pitiful than the last. The sound reminded him of something, though he couldn't quite place it. Maybe it was the way Margaret had cried in those final days at the hospital, trying to hide her pain. He threw off his covers with a frustrated grunt. "This is ridiculous," he said, but his feet were already carrying him to the kitchen. The linoleum felt cold beneath his bare feet as he shuffled across the floor. Bella's whimpering stopped abruptly at his approach, replaced by the sound of her body pressing further under the table. "Hey there," Charlie whispered, keeping his distance. "You thirsty? Hungry, maybe?" He moved slowly to fill a bowl with fresh water, sliding it closer to her hiding spot. Bella remained frozen, her eyes reflecting the dim light like two frightened stars. "Come on, girl. Nobody's going to hurt you here." His voice came out gentler than he'd intended, surprising himself. After a few minutes of one-sided conversation, Charlie gave up. Back in bed, he stared at the ceiling again, listening to Bella's renewed whimpers. Why had he agreed to this? He had enough troubles of his own without taking on a broken dog. The whimpering continued, a soundtrack to his sleepless night. Each cry seemed to dig deeper under his skin, making him increasingly restless. He'd dealt with enough sleepless nights after Margaret passed, but this was different. This wasn't his grief keeping him awake. It was someone else's pain. Hours crawled by. The lamp's glow gradually gave way to morning light streaming through his bedroom window. Charlie's eyes felt like sandpaper as he dragged himself out of bed, his movements sluggish from lack of sleep. In the kitchen, the water bowl remained untouched. The kibble he'd poured out the night before sat scattered across the floor where he'd tried to tempt her. Bella was still under the table, pressed against the wall, watching him with those same frightened eyes. Charlie ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble beneath his palm. "Well," he sighed, "this is gonna be a long day." The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, casting warm patches of light across the worn linoleum floor. Charlie sat at his small wooden table, the familiar scent of eggs and bacon filling the air. His fork clinked against the plate as he ate, trying to ignore the pair of brown eyes watching him from beneath the table. Bella lay there, her golden head resting on her paws, following his every movement. Though she remained hidden in her safe spot, her gaze never left him. Charlie pretended not to notice, focusing instead on cutting his eggs into neat squares. But something about her constant attention made his hands slow down. He glanced at the strip of bacon left on his plate, then at the untouched dog food bowl in the corner. The kibble sat there, just as full as it had been last night. Charlie's jaw tightened as he remembered her whimpers from the night before. "Suppose you might be hungry," he muttered, more to himself than to her. His hand moved slowly as he picked up the bacon strip, careful not to make any sudden movements. Leaning down, he extended his arm toward her, holding the bacon between his fingers. Bella didn't move at first. Her nose twitched at the smell, but fear kept her frozen in place. Charlie waited, his arm starting to ache from holding the awkward position, just as he was about to give. The late morning sun filtered through the dusty garage windows as Charlie worked on his old Chevy truck. His weathered hands moved with practiced ease, adjusting the carburetor while soft country music played from a small portable radio. On a worn blanket near the workbench, Bella lay watching him, her head resting on her paws. Every time Charlie's wrench made contact with metal, Bella's ears twitched. She flinched at the sharper sounds but didn't run away. Charlie found himself stealing glances at her between adjustments, somewhat comforted by her quiet presence. "Hand me that socket wrench, would you?" Charlie muttered, then caught himself talking to the dog. He shook his head, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "Look at me, talking to you like you're going to answer back." The familiar motions of working on the truck settled him into a rhythm. Time slipped by as he tightened bolts and checked connections, occasionally wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. Bella's watchful eyes followed his movements, her body still tense but curious. Then it happened. The wrench slipped from Charlie's grip, hitting the concrete floor with a loud clang that echoed through the garage. Bella scrambled to her feet, her nails scrabbling against the concrete as she bolted toward the house door. "Bella, wait!" Charlie called after her, knowing it was useless. He heard the dog door Debbie had installed flap wildly as Bella rushed through it. Wiping his hands on a shop rag, Charlie followed her inside. The moment he stepped into the living room, his heart stopped. There, on the hardwood floor, lay Margaret's antique Philco radio in pieces. The walnut cabinet was cracked, its brass dial bent, and the glass face shattered across the floor. Memories rushed over him like a tidal wave. Margaret had loved that radio, playing old jazz songs while she cooked Sunday dinners. She'd inherited it from her father, and now... "What did you do?" Charlie's voice thundered through the room. In the corner, Bella pressed herself against the wall, her whole body trembling. "That was Margaret's. That was all I had left." His voice cracked with emotion as he stood over the broken pieces. Bella cowered lower, her tail tucked tightly against her body, eyes wide with fear. The rage and grief swirled inside Charlie until he couldn't contain it anymore. "Get away from me! Just get away!" he shouted, his face red with anger. Turning on his heel, Charlie stormed toward the front door. It slammed behind him with such force that the windows rattled, leaving Bella alone and shaking in the corner, while broken pieces of the radio glinted in the sunlight streaming through the window. Charlie's truck rumbled down the winding back roads, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees, but he barely noticed the scenery passing by. The radio hummed softly, some old country song he and Margaret used to dance to in their kitchen. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice catching. She would have known what to do with Bella. She always knew how to handle broken things, especially that old radio. Charlie could still picture her, sitting cross-legged on the floor, carefully opening up the radio's back panel. "Just needs a gentle touch," she'd say with a smile. The truck climbed a familiar hill, and Charlie pulled into the gravel overlook where he and Margaret used to watch sunsets. He killed the engine and stepped out, the crisp air filling his lungs. Below, the town sprawled out like a patchwork quilt. Tiny houses, church steeples, and the winding river that cut through it all. "What am I doing, Margaret?" he asked the empty air. "I can't even keep a dog calm. What was I thinking?" The words felt heavy in his mouth. He leaned against the truck's hood, remembering how Margaret would curl into his side on chilly evenings up here. After a while, Charlie got back behind the wheel. He drove into town, passing familiar storefronts and quiet neighborhoods. The animal shelter sign appeared ahead. He could just turn in, explain it wasn't working out. Simple as that. But as he approached the turn, Bella's frightened face flashed in his mind. The way she trembled in the corner, eyes wide with fear, just like when she first arrived. His foot eased off the gas pedal, and he drove past the shelter's entrance. The sun was setting by the time Charlie pulled into his driveway. Shadows stretched across his front lawn, making the house look darker, emptier than usual. He sat in the truck for a long moment, key in hand, staring at his front door. A heavy sigh escaped him before he reached for the door handle, dreading what waited inside after his outburst. Charlie pushed open his front door, the hinges creaking in the silence. The living room was exactly as he'd left it, shards of the broken radio scattered across the floor, glinting in the fading daylight. Bella hadn't moved from her corner, her body still curled tight against the wall. Her eyes followed him, wide and watchful, but she didn't make a sound. With heavy steps, Charlie retrieved the broom and dustpan from the kitchen. Each sweep of the broken pieces felt like gathering up memories. The radio's brass dial, now bent and tarnished. The wooden panel Margaret had polished so carefully every Sunday. The cracked speaker that used to fill their home with music. His phone buzzed in his pocket, cutting through the quiet. Charlie fished it out, nearly dropping it when he saw the name on the screen. Jake. His thumb hovered over the answer button, trembling slightly before he pressed it. "Hello?" Charlie's voice came out gruffer than he intended. "Hey, Dad." Jake's voice sounded distant, hesitant. "Just thought I'd check in. See how you're doing." "I'm fine." Charlie continued sweeping one-handed, the phone pressed against his ear. "Everything's fine." A long pause stretched between them. Charlie could hear Jake taking a deep breath on the other end. "Listen, Dad, I've been thinking about, well, everything. Maybe we could try to—" Jake's words came carefully, measured. "Maybe we could start talking again. Properly, I mean." Charlie's grip tightened on the broom handle. "What's there to talk about?" "Dad, please. It's been years. After Mom died—" "I don't want to get into all that right now," Charlie cut in, his voice sharp. In her corner, Bella flinched at his tone. "You never want to get into it." Jake's frustration bled through the phone. That's always been the problem, hasn't it? Charlie felt the familiar wall building up inside him, brick by brick. Look, Jake, I'm tired. It's been a long day. It's always a long day with you, Dad. I can't do this right now, Charlie said firmly. I've got to go. He ended the call before Jake could respond, shoving the phone back in his pocket. The broom clattered against the wall as he dropped it, the remaining pieces of the radio still scattered at his feet. Charlie sank into his recliner, pulling his phone out again. Jake's name stared back at him from the call history. His finger traced the edge of the phone as regret settled heavy in his chest, but the words he needed wouldn't come. Across the room, Bella watched him from her corner, both of them trapped in their own kind of silence. The morning sun crept through Charlie's bedroom window, pulling him from a restless sleep. He rolled over, his joints stiff from another night of tossing and turning. His eyes drifted to the kitchen doorway, where he could see Bella still huddled in her corner. She looked smaller somehow, her golden fur dull in the early light, her body curled tight like she was trying to disappear. Charlie's chest tightened. He'd seen that kind of fear before, in the mirror, after Margaret died. That same look of being lost and alone. In the kitchen, the coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the quiet house with its familiar sound. Charlie sat at the table, his hands wrapped around the warm mug. Yesterday's events played through his mind like an old movie. The crash of the radio, his angry outburst, Jake's voice on the phone. Each memory made him sink lower in his chair. He glanced at Bella again. She hadn't touched her food bowl since yesterday morning. With a sigh, Charlie got up and pulled some bacon from the fridge. He cooked it slowly, letting the smell fill the kitchen. "Hey there," he said softly, crouching down near Bella with a piece of bacon. His voice was gentle, barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry about yesterday." Bella's ears twitched at his voice. She watched him with wary eyes, but her nose quivered at the bacon's scent. Charlie held perfectly still, waiting. After what felt like forever, she inched forward and carefully took the bacon from his fingers. Charlie spent the next hour making Bella's corner more welcoming. He found an old quilted blanket in the hall closet, one Margaret had made years ago, and folded it into a soft bed. He placed fresh water in a clean bowl and arranged her food dish closer to the blanket. Later, Charlie gathered the broken pieces of the radio and carried them to his garage. He spread them out on his workbench, studying each part carefully. Bella followed at a distance, settling on the concrete floor where she could watch him work. "You know," Charlie said as he examined the radio's cracked case, "Margaret loved this old thing. Used to play it every Sunday morning while she made breakfast." He picked up a loose wire, turning it in his fingers. "Jake would come running down the stairs when he smelled pancakes cooking." Bella's ears perked up at his voice. Charlie continued working, sharing memories as his hands moved over the broken pieces. He told her about Margaret's favorite songs, about teaching Jake to dance in the kitchen, about all the Sunday mornings that seemed so precious now that they were gone. "I really messed things up with Jake," he admitted, carefully fitting two pieces of the wooden casing together. "After we lost Margaret, I just couldn't find the right words anymore." Bella watched him silently, her head tilted slightly as if she was really listening. There was something comforting about her presence, about having someone to talk to who wouldn't judge or argue back. The garage was quiet except for the soft ticking of Charlie's old wall clock. Morning sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across his workbench. Charlie carefully arranged the broken pieces of the antique radio, his weathered hands hovering over each part like he was handling precious gems. A few feet away, Bella lay on her blanket, her amber eyes following his every move. Though her body remained tense, ready to bolt at any sudden noise, there was curiosity in her gaze. "This old thing," Charlie muttered, picking up a loose wire. Margaret found it at a yard sale back in '82. He glanced at Bella, who tilted her head slightly. She loved music, you see. Said a house without music was like a garden without flowers. Charlie's fingers worked methodically, cleaning each component with careful attention. Every Sunday morning, she'd turn this on while making breakfast. The kitchen would fill with old country songs. He paused, a small smile tugging at his lips. Jake used to complain about the noise, but I'd catch him humming those same tunes later. The mention of Jake made Charlie's hands still. He set down his tools and leaned back in his chair. I wasn't much of a father after we'd lost her, he admitted quietly. Couldn't even look at Jake sometimes. He has her eyes, you know. Bella's ears twitched at the change in his voice. Charlie continued working on the radio, but the words kept coming, like a dam finally breaking. Should have been there for him more. Instead, I just shut down, pushed him away when he needed me most. Mid-morning light filled the garage as Charlie reached for a small bag of dog treats. Here, girl, he said softly, holding one out. Bella stretched her neck forward, taking the treat gently from his fingers. Her tail gave a slight wag. Just a small movement, but it made Charlie's chest feel lighter. At least you're giving me a chance, he said, watching her nibble the treat. More than I deserve, probably. Hours passed as Charlie worked, sharing stories about Margaret's laugh and Jake's childhood adventures. The radio slowly began taking shape under his careful hands, though it was far from fixed. Bella remained attentive, her body gradually relaxing as his quiet voice filled the garage. By late afternoon, Charlie's eyes were tired from squinting at tiny components. He set his tools down and looked at his progress. We'll finish this tomorrow, girl, he said to Bella, feeling oddly accomplished despite the work still ahead. Her eyes followed him as he stood, watching him with what seemed like newfound interest. The morning sun cast long shadows across Charlie's front porch as he held the old leather leash in his hands. He found it tucked away in a bag of supplies Debbie had left, a worn but sturdy thing that felt rough against his calloused palm. Come here, girl, he called softly to Bella, who watched him from her corner with wary eyes. Charlie crouched down, making himself smaller, and held out his hand. It's okay. We're just going for a little walk. Bella pressed herself against the wall, her golden fur bristling slightly. Charlie waited, speaking in low, gentle tones, until she finally took a tentative step forward. When he reached for her collar, she flinched but didn't pull away. The leash clicked into place. Outside, the autumn air was crisp and clean. Bella's paws barely made a sound on the wooden porch steps as she crept down them, staying close to Charlie's leg. Her body was low to the ground, tail tucked tight underneath. This way, Charlie murmured, starting down the dirt road. Gravel crunched beneath their feet as they walked slowly past the old maple tree at the end of his driveway. Margaret planted that tree the year we moved in, he told Bella. Said every home needs some shade. They continued their careful journey, Charlie pointing out landmarks along the way. That's where I taught Jake to ride his bike, he said, nodding toward a gentle slope. Skinned his knee something awful, but he got right back up. After a few minutes, Charlie noticed Bella's tail had loosened slightly from its tight curl. Her ears, while still alert, weren't pressed quite so flat against her head. She matched his pace, staying close but walking with slightly more confidence. When they turned back toward home, Charlie felt a small surge of pride. Bella's steps were steadier now, though she still startled at distant sounds. Back at the house, he unclipped the leash and watched as she hesitated for a moment by his side before padding back to her blanket. Charlie hung the leash on a hook by the door, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't much, but it was progress. The morning sun warmed Charlie's face as he settled onto the porch steps after their walk. His joints creaked a bit, reminding him of his age. He patted the wooden step beside him. Come on, girl. Take a load off. Bella hesitated, her amber eyes studying him. Then slowly, she padded over and sat down about 2 feet away. It wasn't close enough to touch, but closer than she'd ever been by choice. Charlie's heart swelled a little at this small victory. You know, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I used to sit here with Jake when he was little. We'd watch the sunset together. He paused, running a hand over his weathered face. After Margaret passed, I just couldn't handle it. Shut everyone out, including my own son. Bella's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, her eyes fixed on him with that steady gaze that made Charlie feel truly seen for the first time in years. Later in the garage, Charlie spread out his tools next to the partially repaired radio. Bella followed him in, settling down closer to his workbench than usual. The familiar click of her nails on the concrete floor was oddly comforting. Jake tried to help, you know, Charlie continued as he worked, carefully fitting pieces back together. Kept calling, stopping by. But I pushed him away. Thought I was protecting myself from more pain, I guess. He glanced at Bella, who watched him intently. Instead, I just made everything worse. As the afternoon light filtered through the dusty garage windows, Charlie found himself sharing more memories. Stories about Jake's first baseball game, teaching him to drive, the proud day he graduated college. Bella stayed close, her presence steady and accepting. That evening, Charlie eased into his old recliner with a cup of tea. The familiar creak of the chair's springs filled the room. To his surprise, Bella dragged her blanket closer to his chair before lying down. Her eyes drifted closed, but her ears remained alert to his movements. Charlie looked around his living room. The same furniture, the same pictures on the walls, but somehow the space felt different, less empty, less lonely. He sipped his tea, listening to Bella's soft breathing, and felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the garage windows as Charlie tightened the final screw on the antique radio. He sat back, wiping his brow with satisfaction. Bella lay nearby on her blanket, her golden fur catching the sunlight. The peaceful quiet was broken by the sharp ring of his phone. Charlie's stomach tightened when he saw Jake's name on the screen. His thumb hovered over the answer button before he finally pressed it. Hello? His voice came out softer than usual. Hi, Dad. Jake's voice carried a warmth that caught Charlie off guard. Thanks for picking up. I've been thinking about our last call. Charlie leaned back in his chair, his free hand absently fiddling with a screwdriver. Yeah, me too. Things are good here, Jake continued. Got a promotion at work last month. Sarah's garden is doing well. He paused. I miss you, Dad. The words hung in the air. Charlie's throat felt tight. I miss you too, son. But when Jake mentioned Margaret's anniversary coming up, the familiar tension crept back in. You didn't even come to the memorial service last year, Jake said, his voice strained. I couldn't. Charlie's defenses rose. You don't understand. Because you never let me. Jake's voice cracked with frustration. Charlie felt his pulse quicken, but then he felt something warm against his leg. Bella had moved closer, pressing gently against him. Her steady presence helped him take a deep breath. Maybe you're right, Charlie managed, his voice rough. It's just hard. The conversation ended shortly after, still tense but less bitter than before. Jake's last words lingered. Can we try again, Dad? Keep talking? Charlie nodded, though Jake couldn't see it. Yeah, we can try. After hanging up, Charlie looked down at Bella, who gazed back with those understanding eyes. Well, girl, he said quietly, I guess I'm not the only one trying to figure things out. He placed the newly repaired radio on his workbench, running his fingers along its restored surface. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty garage windows, casting warm patches of light across the concrete floor. Charlie worked on his vintage truck, the familiar clink of tools providing a steady rhythm to his day. He hummed an old country tune, one Margaret used to love, as he adjusted the carburetor. Bella lay on her blanket nearby, her golden fur catching the sunlight. For the first time since she'd arrived, her eyes were half closed, her body relaxed instead of tense. Charlie glanced at her and felt a small surge of pride at how far they'd come. A strange rustling sound broke the peaceful quiet. Charlie turned to see Bella with his leather work glove in her mouth, the fabric already torn and dangling. "What are you doing?" he shouted, his voice sharp and thunderous in the enclosed space. "Bad dog." Bella dropped the glove instantly. Her whole body went rigid with fear, and she scrambled backward, seeking refuge under the workbench. Her eyes were wide with terror as she pressed herself against the wall, trembling violently. The sight of her cowering hit Charlie like a punch to the gut. All their progress, all the trust they'd built, gone in an instant because he couldn't control his temper. He picked up the mangled glove, turning it over in his hands. "It's just a glove," he muttered, shame washing over him. "What's wrong with me?" Later, Charlie crouched near the workbench with a treat in his outstretched hand. "Come on, girl," he said softly. But Bella remained frozen, her eyes fixed on him with renewed fear. The same fear she'd shown when she first arrived. Sighing heavily, Charlie placed the treat on the floor and backed away. As he watched her continue to tremble, he realized how much of his anger, at losing Margaret, at failing Jake, at his own mistakes, he'd been taking out on this innocent creature who'd known nothing but fear her whole life. The setting sun painted long shadows across the garage floor as Charlie sat on the porch steps. Through the open garage door, he could see Bella still huddled under the workbench, refusing to move. "I'm sorry, girl," he whispered into the evening air, though she was too far away to hear. The morning sun crept through the garage windows as Charlie approached Bella's hiding spot under the workbench. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, trying not to startle her. In his hand, he held a piece of bacon, her favorite treat. "Hey, girl," he said softly, kneeling down a few feet away. "I'm sorry about yesterday." Bella watched him from her corner, her body still tense. Charlie placed the bacon on the floor and sat back, giving her space. Minutes ticked by in silence. Finally, Bella inched forward, her nose twitching at the tempting smell. With careful movements, she stretched her neck out and snatched the bacon, quickly retreating to her safe spot. But this time, she stayed closer to the edge of the workbench. Charlie felt a small spark of hope bloom in his chest. "That's it, good girl." Later that afternoon, Charlie decided to take Bella outside. The autumn air was crisp, and fallen leaves crunched under their feet as they walked around the yard. Charlie noticed how Bella seemed to relax slightly, her head lifting to catch the breeze. Almost without thinking, he picked up a stick from the ground and tossed it a short distance. It wasn't much of a throw, just a gentle underhand toss that landed about 10 feet away. But something changed in Bella's demeanor. Her ears perked up. Her body, usually so hunched and defensive, straightened slightly. Charlie held his breath as she took a tentative step toward the stick, then another, and another. When she picked it up in her mouth, Charlie's heart skipped a beat. But what happened next brought tears to his eyes. Bella turned and trotted back to him, her tail wagging with real joy for the first time since she'd arrived. Charlie knelt down, his voice thick with emotion. "Good girl, Bella. Such a good girl." She dropped the stick at his feet, her tail still wagging, and Charlie saw something new in her eyes, a spark of life, of trust, of happiness. In that moment, he realized they were both healing, both learning to trust again, both finding their way back from the darkness. That evening, Bella lay near Charlie's feet as he sat in his recliner. The distance between them was smaller than ever before, both physically and emotionally. Charlie looked down at her and whispered, "We're both getting there, aren't we?" The kitchen was quiet, except for the gentle clinking of dishes as Charlie washed them. The evening light cast long shadows across the floor where Bella lay nearby, her presence a comforting constant. Charlie glanced at her occasionally, still amazed at how far they'd come together. A strange sound broke the peaceful silence. Charlie turned, his soapy hands dripping on the floor. Bella was trying to stand, but her legs trembled violently. Her body shook as she collapsed back down, making awful whimpering sounds that turned Charlie's blood cold. "Bella?" His voice cracked with fear. He rushed to her side, his heart pounding. "What's wrong, girl?" Charlie's hands shook as he reached for his phone, dialing Debbie's number. Bella's breathing was labored, and her eyes looked glazed with pain. Come on, he muttered as the phone rang. "Hello?" "Debbie, something's wrong with Bella. She can't stand up, and she's shaking real bad." Charlie's voice was thick with panic. "Get her to the emergency vet right now," Debbie said firmly. "I'll meet you there." Charlie grabbed a blanket and carefully wrapped it around Bella's trembling body. "It's okay, girl. We're going to get you help." He lifted her as gently as he could, his heart breaking at her weak whimper. The drive to the vet was torture. Every red light felt like an eternity as Charlie gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "Hold on, Bella," he kept saying, glancing in his rearview mirror at her huddled form in the back seat. "Just hold on." At the vet's office, they whisked Bella away for examination. Charlie paced the waiting room, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When the veterinarian finally emerged, her face was serious. "Mr. Grayson, Bella has a severe kidney infection that's gone untreated for some time. It likely developed before she came to the shelter." The vet explained the treatment plan: medication, IV fluids, and possibly a few days of hospitalization. The good news is, with proper treatment, she should recover. However, the cost of treatment will be significant. Charlie didn't hesitate. "Whatever she needs, just do it." As the vet left to begin Bella's treatment, Charlie sank into a chair in the waiting room. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heavy with worry. The thought of losing Bella now, after everything they'd been through together, was unbearable. The cost didn't matter. She was family now, and he'd find a way to make it work. The morning sun cast a soft glow through the vet clinic windows as Charlie waited to bring Bella home. When the nurse brought her out, his heart squeezed at how small and fragile she looked. Bandages wrapped around her middle, and her usual bright eyes were clouded with exhaustion. "Easy now, girl," Charlie murmured, gathering her gently in his arms. She felt lighter than before, making his worry deepen. In the truck, he arranged a blanket on the passenger seat and placed her carefully on top. Every bump in the road made him wince, watching to make sure she was comfortable. Back home, Charlie transformed his living room into a recovery space. He moved his recliner closer to Bella's bed and arranged her water bowl, medications, and fresh blankets within easy reach. The vet's instructions lay on the coffee table, covered in his careful notes about medication times and dosages. Sitting at his kitchen table, Charlie spread out the vet bills and took a deep breath. The numbers made his stomach turn. The treatment had cost more than 3 months of his pension. He pulled out his checkbook and savings records, his hands trembling slightly as he looked at the account he'd set aside for Margaret's headstone. "I'm sorry, Margaret," he whispered, his voice thick, "but I think you'd understand." Throughout the day, Charlie stayed close to Bella. When lunchtime came, she wouldn't touch her food bowl. Charlie sat cross-legged beside her bed, holding small pieces of chicken in his palm until she found the strength to eat. Each tiny bite felt like a victory. "That's it, good girl," he encouraged, his voice soft. "Just a little more." The medication schedule kept him busy. Pills every 4 hours, wrapped in bits of cheese to make them easier to swallow. Charlie set alarms on his phone, determined not to miss a single dose. Between treatments, he talked to her quietly, telling her stories about Margaret and his early days as a truck driver. Late in the afternoon, Bella lifted her head slightly and gave his hand a weak lick. Charlie's eyes welled up at this small sign of affection. Later, when he changed her water bowl, her tail thumped twice against her blanket, the tiniest wag, but enough to make his heart soar. As night fell, Charlie settled into his recliner beside Bella's bed. The house was quiet except for her soft breathing. He reached down to stroke her head gently, and she leaned ever so slightly into his touch. Looking at her peaceful face, Charlie felt something shift inside him, a certainty that transcended his financial worries. This was where he needed to be, what he needed to do. In the dim light of his reading lamp, Charlie watched Bella sleep. "You're worth it, girl," he whispered, feeling a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for far too long. The early morning light filtered through the living room curtains as Charlie shuffled in, his joints stiff from sleeping in the recliner. Bella lay curled on her bed, her golden fur catching the sunlight. When he approached, her eyes fluttered open, tired but alert. "Morning, girl. Let's see if we can get you feeling better today," Charlie said softly, kneeling beside her. His hand moved gently over her head, careful to avoid the tender spots. In the kitchen, Charlie prepared Bella's morning medication with methodical care. He cut the chicken into tiny pieces, tucking each pill inside. The vet's instructions lay nearby, covered in his penciled notes. Returning to Bella, he held out the first piece. "Come on, sweetie. This'll help you feel better." Bella sniffed the chicken cautiously before taking it from his palm. Charlie waited patiently as she worked through each medicated piece, praising her softly. Later, as he cleaned her bandages with gentle hands, Charlie found himself talking. "Margaret would have known exactly what to do here," he said, carefully securing a fresh bandage. "She always knew how to make things better." Bella's eyes stayed fixed on him, steady and warm. Something about her quiet presence made it easier to keep talking. "I wasn't there enough, you know," Charlie continued, his voice growing thick. "After Margaret got sick, I just shut down. Jake needed his father, and I couldn't." He swallowed hard. I couldn't be what he needed. When it was time for Bella's short walk, Charlie supported her weight as she wobbled to her feet. They made it to the backyard, taking small steps together. Bella's legs trembled, but she pressed forward, determined. "That's it, girl. Nice and easy," Charlie encouraged. He couldn't help but smile when she managed to squat briefly before needing his help again. Back inside, Bella settled onto her bed, exhausted but content. She licked Charlie's hand as he adjusted her blanket, a small gesture that made his heart swell. Throughout the day, Charlie maintained his vigil. He measured water intake, monitored her breathing, and kept track of every medication dose. Between these tasks, he continued to talk, sharing memories of Margaret's laugh and Jake's childhood baseball games. Bella listened, her presence somehow making the weight of these memories easier to bear. As evening approached, Charlie sat on the couch next to Bella's bed. Her tail thumped weakly against the blanket as he stroked her head. "We're gonna get through this, girl," he whispered. "One step at a time." Charlie sat at his kitchen table, pen hovering over paper. Sunlight streamed through the window, warming his shoulders as he began to write. "Dear Jake," he started, then paused. The words came slowly at first, then faster as his heart opened. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. About us, about your mom, about all the ways I let you down." His pen scratched across the paper as he poured out years of regret and longing. Bella watched from her bed, her eyes following his movements. "I didn't know how to be there for you after we lost her," he wrote. "I was drowning in my own grief, and instead of reaching out, I pushed you away. That was wrong of me, son. You deserved better." Just as he sealed the envelope, a knock echoed through the house. Charlie's heart skipped when he opened the door to find Jake standing there, letter in hand. "Got your letter, Dad," Jake said quietly. "Figured it was time we talked." Charlie stepped back, gesturing inside. "Come in, son." They settled in the living room, the air thick with unspoken words. Charlie perched on his recliner while Jake took the couch, both men avoiding direct eye contact. The soft click of paws on hardwood broke the silence. Bella, still moving gingerly from her surgery, made her way to Jake. She rested her head on his knee, tail wagging softly. Jake's face softened as he scratched behind her ears. "She seems like a good dog." "She is," Charlie nodded. "Been through a rough patch, but she's getting better." The conversation started slowly. Jake's work, the weather, safe topics that didn't hurt. But gradually, like water wearing down stone, deeper truths emerged. "After Mom died," Jake said, his voice tight, "I needed you, but you weren't there." Charlie's hands trembled in his lap. "I know. I was lost, Jake. Couldn't see past my own pain. By the time I realized what I'd done, the distance felt too big to cross." Bella shifted closer to Jake, pressing against his leg as if lending him strength. He continued petting her, his shoulders gradually relaxing. "I miss her every day," Charlie admitted. "But losing you too, that was my fault. My biggest regret." Jake nodded, tears gathering in his eyes. "I miss her too, Dad. And I've missed you." They talked for hours, working through years of hurt and misunderstanding. When Jake finally stood to leave, he promised to come back soon. Charlie watched his son's car disappear down the driveway. Looking down at Bella, he whispered, "Looks like you're helping me fix more than I expected, girl." Charlie stood in the kitchen, measuring out Bella's medication with careful precision. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, catching the golden highlights in her fur. As he mixed the pills into her food, he noticed her tail wagging, a sight that still made his heart warm. "Someone's feeling better," he said softly, setting down her bowl. The sound of tires on gravel announced Jake's arrival. Charlie felt a flutter of anticipation rather than the usual anxiety. Jake walked in carrying a bag of dog treats and wearing a gentle smile. "Thought we could take her for a short walk later," Jake suggested, kneeling to pet Bella. They settled on the porch, the wooden boards creaking beneath their chairs. Bella lay between them, her breathing steady and calm. The afternoon stretched before them, unhurried and peaceful. "Remember that Thanksgiving when Mom tried to deep fry the turkey?" Jake asked, chuckling. Charlie's eyes crinkled with laughter. "Lord, what a disaster! Smoke everywhere, and she just stood there saying, 'It's supposed to look like that.'" "And those summer road trips," Jake added. "Mom singing along to the radio, completely off-key." "She didn't care who heard her," Charlie smiled, lost in the memory. "Just belted it out anyway." When it was time for Bella's afternoon walk, Jake helped Charlie attach her leash. They walked slowly, matching Bella's careful pace. Jake filled her water bowl when they returned, the simple act of caring for her together, bridging years of distance. Bella's tail wagged more frequently throughout the day, and at one point she let out a soft, happy bark, her first since arriving. Both men turned to her in surprise, then shared a knowing look. As evening approached, they sat back on the porch. The setting sun painted the sky in deep oranges and purples. Bella dozed between their chairs, her tail moving gently back and forth. The house behind them felt different now, warmer, more alive. Charlie glanced at his son, seeing shadows of the boy he'd been and the man he'd become, and felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the backyard as Charlie stepped onto the grass, Jake following close behind. Bella trotted between them, her steps lighter and more confident than they'd been in weeks. The fresh air carried the sweet scent of newly cut grass and late summer flowers. "Think she's up for a little play?" Charlie asked, reaching for a tennis ball he'd left on the porch railing. Jake nodded, watching Bella sniff around the yard. "Worth a try. She seems stronger today." Charlie held up the ball, letting Bella see it. Her ears perked up, but uncertainty flickered in her eyes. He tossed it gently, the ball bouncing softly on the grass a few yards away. Bella stood still, looking from Charlie to the ball and back again. "It's okay, girl," Charlie encouraged, his voice warm and steady. Something shifted in Bella's demeanor. She took a tentative step forward, then another. Suddenly, she burst into motion, bounding across the yard. Her golden fur gleamed in the sunlight as she snatched up the ball and raced back to Charlie, tail wagging with newfound enthusiasm. "Would you look at that?" Charlie beamed, pride swelling in his chest. Jake laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "Here, let me try." He took the ball from Charlie and threw it in a gentle arc. This time Bella didn't hesitate. She chased after it immediately, barking with excitement, a joyful sound that filled the yard. Back and forth they went, taking turns throwing the ball. Bella's energy seemed boundless, her previous illness forgotten in the pure joy of play. Her barks echoed through the yard, punctuated by Charlie and Jake's laughter. Charlie couldn't remember the last time he'd heard Jake laugh like this, free and unguarded, like when he was a boy. The sound mixed with Bella's happy barks created a melody that made his heart feel full. Finally, Bella flopped down in the grass, panting contentedly. Her tongue lolled out, and her eyes sparkled with happiness. Jake sat down beside her, scratching behind her ears. Charlie watched them both, feeling the warmth of the moment wash over him. "She's come a long way, hasn't she?" Jake looked up at his father, a soft smile on his face. "We all have, Dad." The morning sun cast long shadows across Charlie's garage as he stood before his vintage truck, methodically arranging his tools on the workbench. The familiar smell of oil and metal filled the air, bringing back memories of countless hours spent tinkering with the old vehicle. The sound of tires crunching on gravel drew his attention. Jake's car pulled into the driveway, and Charlie felt a warmth spread through his chest. His son stepped out, casual and relaxed. "Need a hand?" Jake called out, walking toward the garage. The screen door creaked, and Bella trotted out from the house, her tail wagging enthusiastically. She let out a soft, welcoming bark at Jake's arrival, her whole body wiggling with excitement. Father and son stood side by side, examining the truck's engine. Their hands worked in sync, passing tools back and forth as they tackled the repairs together. The silence between them felt comfortable now, nothing like the tense quiet that used to fill their conversations. "Remember that trip to the Grand Canyon?" Jake asked, wiping grease from his hands. "When the radiator started smoking halfway through Arizona?" Charlie chuckled. "Your mother was convinced we'd end up stranded in the desert. Made me promise to get it checked before every trip after that." "She always knew best," Jake smiled, adjusting a bolt. "Remember how she'd sit in the passenger seat with her map spread out, refusing to trust the GPS?" Bella padded over to Jake, pressing her nose against his leg. He reached down to scratch behind her ears, and she leaned into his touch, tail thumping against the concrete floor. "Jake," Charlie said, his voice softening, "I want to thank you for coming back. for giving this old man another chance." Jake paused, wrench in hand. "Dad, you don't have to." "No, I do," Charlie insisted. "It means a lot having you here." Jake nodded, focusing on the engine. "I'm glad we're doing this too," he admitted quietly. "Really glad." Bella moved between them, offering gentle nudges and soft whines, as if encouraging their conversation. She settled near the workbench, watching them with bright eyes as they continued working. Hours passed as they tinkered with the engine, sharing stories and memories. Finally, Charlie turned the key. The engine roared to life, its familiar rumble filling the garage. Jake's face split into a wide grin as he patted Charlie's back. "Looks like you've still got it, Dad." Charlie glanced at Bella, who sat alert and tail-wagging, and chuckled. "Guess we all needed a little fixing up." Charlie's hands trembled slightly as he sat at the kitchen table, carefully reading through the adoption paperwork. Sunlight streamed through the window, warming the scattered papers before him. Bella lay at his feet, her golden fur catching the morning light. Debbie stood nearby, watching with a gentle smile as Charlie picked up his pen. "Take your time," she said softly. "It's a big moment." Charlie nodded, his throat tight with emotion, as he began signing his name. Each stroke of the pen felt significant, like he was writing a new chapter in both their lives. Bella seemed to sense the importance of the moment, lifting her head to watch him with those soulful eyes that had once been so full of fear. "She's yours now, officially," Debbie announced warmly as Charlie signed the final document. Charlie reached down to scratch behind Bella's ears, his heart full. "Hear that, girl? You're stuck with me now." Bella's tail thumped against the floor, her whole body wiggling with joy. The morning air felt crisp and clean as they stepped outside for a celebratory walk. Bella bounded ahead, her confidence a far cry from the trembling dog who'd first arrived at Charlie's door. She paused every few steps to look back at him, her tail wagging like a victory flag. When Jake's car pulled up later that afternoon, Bella ran to greet him, barking happily. "Look at you, girl," Jake laughed, kneeling to receive her enthusiastic welcome. "Ready for another walk?" The three of them set out across the property, following the familiar path they'd walked so many times during Bella's recovery. Jake matched his father's pace, their shoulders occasionally brushing as they walked. "You know, Dad," Jake said, watching Bella investigate a cluster of wildflowers, "I've been thinking. That old shed needs fixing, and the fence could use some work. I could come by weekends, help you tackle those projects." Charlie's heart swelled at the suggestion. The idea of regular visits with his son filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. "That'd be nice," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. The sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks as evening approached. Charlie stood in the yard, watching Bella chase butterflies through the tall grass, her movements full of grace and joy. Jake stepped up beside him, hands in his pockets. "Feels good to have a family again," Charlie said softly. Jake smiled, his eyes on Bella's playful antics. "It's just the beginning, Dad." Dust motes danced in the morning sunlight as Charlie and Jake tackled the cluttered garage. Old tools clinked against each other as they sorted through decades of accumulated items. Bella watched from her usual spot near the workbench, her tail sweeping the concrete floor. "What's this?" Jake asked, pulling a leather-bound book from behind a stack of boxes. He brushed off the dust, revealing a worn photo album. Charlie's breath caught. "I'd forgotten about that one." He set down the wrench he'd been holding and moved closer to Jake. They sat on two old stools, the album spread across their knees. The first page showed Margaret in their backyard, her smile bright as ever, holding a young Jake on her hip. Charlie's throat tightened. "Remember this camping trip?" Jake pointed to a faded photograph of the three of them beside a lake. "Mom insisted on bringing that ridiculous inflatable raft." Charlie chuckled softly. And it had a hole in it before we even got it in the water. Page after page brought back memories. Birthdays, holidays, ordinary moments that now felt precious. The silence between them grew heavy with unspoken words. "Jake," Charlie finally said, his voice rough, "I need to tell you something." He closed the album gently. "After your mother died, I shut down. Pushed you away when you needed me most. I was wrong, son. So wrong." Jake stared at his hands, his shoulders tense. "It was hard, Dad. Really hard. I lost Mom, and then it felt like I lost you too." "I didn't know how to handle it," Charlie admitted. "Couldn't even look at you without seeing her face. But that's no excuse for leaving you alone with your grief." Tears welled in Jake's eyes. "I didn't know what to do. Every time I tried to reach out, it felt like talking to a wall." Bella sensed the emotion in the air and padded over, wedging herself between them. She nuzzled Jake's hand, her warm presence offering comfort. Jake scratched her ears absently. Suddenly, Bella decided Jake's lap looked inviting. She attempted to climb up, all 60 pounds of her, nearly toppling both Jake and the stool. "Whoa, girl!" Jake laughed, steadying himself. Charlie couldn't help joining in, the tension breaking like a summer storm. As their laughter faded, Jake stood and pulled his father into a tight hug. Charlie held his son close, fighting back tears. "I'm proud of you, son," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink as Charlie, Jake, and Bella settled onto the weathered porch. The old wooden chairs creaked softly beneath them while Bella sprawled at their feet, her tail sweeping back and forth across the boards in a gentle rhythm. A cool evening breeze rustled through the leaves, carrying the sweet scent of autumn. "Been thinking, Dad," Jake said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Maybe I could come by next weekend. Help you finish up that carburetor on the truck." Charlie nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That'd be nice. Could use an extra pair of hands." "And I noticed the gutters need cleaning," Jake continued, leaning forward in his chair. "We could tackle that too. Make a weekend of it." "You don't have to," Charlie started, but Jake cut him off with a warm smile. "I want to, Dad. It's time." Bella lifted her head at the sound of their voices, her brown eyes moving between them. Charlie reached down to scratch behind her ears, marveling at how far she'd come from that terrified dog who'd hidden under his kitchen table. "Funny how a scared little dog could do all this," Charlie mused, watching as Bella's tail thumped harder against the porch. Jake looked at his father, understanding in his eyes. "She saved you, Dad. And maybe she saved us both." Charlie swallowed hard, knowing the truth in those words. The broken radio, the shared walks, the quiet moments in the garage, each small step with Bella had somehow led them here, to this peaceful evening and the promise of more to come. The sun continued its descent, casting long shadows across the yard. Bella shifted, resting her head on Charlie's lap as the golden light faded to purple. Her presence felt right, like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. Jake gazed at the darkening horizon, then back at his father and Bella. "This is how it's supposed to be," he said softly. The morning sun peeked over the horizon as Charlie stirred his coffee, breathing in the crisp air. Bella sat by his feet on the porch, her tail sweeping across the wooden boards in a steady rhythm. The screen door creaked, and Jake appeared with 2 steaming mugs. "Thought you could use a refill," Jake said, handing one to his father. Charlie accepted the mug with a grateful nod. "You're up early?" "Couldn't sleep. Too many ideas running through my head." Bella bounded down the porch steps, chasing a sparrow that had landed in the dewy grass. Her playful barks echoed across the yard as she darted back and forth, her golden coat shimmering in the morning light. "She sure has changed," Jake observed, watching Bella's joyful dance. "Remember how scared she used to be?" Charlie smiled, remembering the trembling dog who'd hidden under his kitchen table. "Hard to believe it's the same Bella." They sat in comfortable silence, sipping their coffee, while Bella continued her pursuit of the birds. The morning air was filled with chirping and the occasional excited bark. "Dad," Jake said, setting down his mug, "I've been thinking about the truck. Once we get it running properly—" He paused, gauging his father's reaction. "Maybe we could take a road trip. Nothing too fancy, just a few days exploring the countryside, like we used to." Charlie felt warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. "That sounds real nice, son." Bella trotted back up to the porch, panting happily from her morning exercise. She settled between their chairs, her presence a reminder of how much had changed. "We could pack some camping gear," Jake continued, his voice growing animated. "Maybe head up to the lake. Bet Bella would love swimming." Charlie reached down to scratch behind Bella's ears, feeling overwhelmed with gratitude. This dog, who'd arrived broken and afraid, had somehow pieced their family back together. The morning sun climbed higher, bathing the porch in golden light. Charlie looked at Jake, then at Bella, and said softly, "We've got a lot to look forward to." Bella's tail thumped against the porch boards as if in agreement, her eyes bright with contentment as she sat between father and son. If you enjoyed the story of Charlie, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.